The moving truck pulled away from Maple Ridge at 7:14 in the morning, and Cordelia Ashford stood on the brick sidewalk watching it go, with a ceramic mug of tea in her hand that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. She had not moved since the second man dropped the last bag at her feet and said without looking at her, "That's everything, ma'am," and walked back to the cab like she was already part of the past. 3 suitcases, 1 garbage bag of shoes, a cardboard box labeled "Fragile" in black marker which contained the photo albums from the hall closet. Albums that a stranger had labeled without understanding what fragile actually meant. Thaddeus Ashford stood on the front steps of the house that was no longer hers. He wore the brown leather loafers he reserved for days he considered important. His hands were in his pockets, and he was checking his watch. His Rolex. The one she had stood beside him to choose at the jeweler on Jewelers Row in 1998. Paid for with the bonus check from the first commercial project his company had landed. A project she had drawn. Every wall, every load-bearing point, every elevation drafted by hand on the kitchen table while their son Barrett slept in a bouncer at her feet. She had spent 11 days on those drawings. Her name was not on a single page of them. Thaddeus did not remember that. Or he remembered it the way people remember inconvenient things. Which is to say, he had arranged the memory into a shape that did not require him to feel anything about it. In the Range Rover, parked behind the moving truck, Victoria Lane sat in the passenger seat with her eyes on her phone. She was 31 years old, a corporate attorney with a laugh that could cut glass. And she had looked at Cordelia once during the property settlement meeting the previous spring, with an expression that Cordelia had spent months trying to name. It was not cruelty. It was something worse. It was the look of someone who has not yet learned what loss costs, and who cannot imagine ever learning. Barrett came down the front steps. He was 34 years old. Cordelia's firstborn, a commercial real estate broker who worked out of his father's building and played golf with his father on Sunday mornings, and had over the course of the previous decade made a series of small, careful choices that had moved him incrementally and irrevocably from being her son to being Thaddeus's. He wore a fleece vest and he stopped 2 steps above the sidewalk, which meant he was taller than her, which she understood was not accidental. He said he was sorry about how everything had worked out. Cordelia looked at him for a moment. Then she asked quietly one question. "Barrett, the $180,000 your father moved into a separate account 8 months before he filed the papers, did you know about that?" Barrett looked at the sidewalk. The space between them, which had been closing for years, closed the rest of the way in that silence. "He's trying to be fair," Barrett said finally. Cordelia nodded once. She picked up the first suitcase, then the second, then the third. She loaded her entire life into the trunk of a silver Camry with a cracked windshield while her ex-husband looked at his phone, and her son stood on the porch of a house she had chosen, decorated, and defended from every storm for 28 years. The Range Rover horn beeped softly. Thaddeus slid his phone into his pocket and descended the steps without looking back. When the Camry pulled away, Cordelia did not cry. She sat straight in the back seat. and looked at the headrest in front of her and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not grief which she had been bracing for, something stranger. The specific lightness of a person who has just set down a weight they have been carrying so long they forgot they were carrying it. The extended stay motel on Route 1 in Riverside cost $71 a night and smelled like carpet shampoo and someone else's cigarettes. Cordelia took a room on the second floor. She unpacked one suitcase and left the other two zipped. She set her coffee mug on the desk at exactly the angle she had kept it on the kitchen desk at Maple Ridge for 28 years. A habit so deep it happened before she was conscious of it. Then she looked at the cup on the particle board surface of the motel desk and understood that this was what grief actually felt like. Not a wave, a detail. The wrong desk under the right cup. The first week she slept 13 hours a night. The second week she could not sleep at all. She applied for apartments in 3 different neighborhoods. Every landlord required first month, last month, and security deposit plus proof of current income. Her teaching pension from the 5 years she had worked before Barrett was born paid her $612 a month. Her Social Security would not reach full value until 67. The $47,000 she had received as her settlement was draining like bathwater. She was not naive about the math. She had never been naive about math. That was the thing about being the person who handled the household accounts for 35 years, while also drafting the architectural blueprints that built a company's reputation. She was very, very good at math. The math was what kept her awake. On a Tuesday night in the 3rd week, Cordelia opened her laptop and typed her own name into the search bar. Cordelia Ashford. She found herself on a parent advisory board list from 2003, a group photograph from the Ashford construction Christmas dinner of 2011, her face half obscured by the person standing in front of her. A charitable foundation membership page where she appeared in the acknowledgments column under special thanks. No work, no designs, no trace of her professional mind. She tried her maiden name, Cordelia Caldwell. 4 pages deep in the results, a single line from the Cornell Daily Sun. 1986. Cordelia Caldwell, 3rd-year architecture student, received honorable mention for her adaptive reuse proposal of the Ithaca Rail Depot. She sat with that sentence for a long time. She could still see the drawings. She could still smell the vellum in the studio at 3 in the morning. The particular cold of a November draft coming under the door, the way the pencil felt in her hand when everything she knew about space and light and what buildings owe to the people who inhabit them was flowing out through her fingers onto paper. She had been 22 years old, and she had not been afraid of anything. That one sentence in a student newspaper from 38 years ago was the only evidence remaining on the public internet that Cordelia Caldwell, the architect, not the wife, had ever existed. The phone rang. Vivian. Vivian was 31, the younger of Cordelia's 2 children, and she called not to ask how her mother was doing, but to deliver a message she had clearly been given. If Cordelia did not complicate the ongoing review of certain asset classifications, there might be room for a supplemental arrangement. Cordelia waited until Vivian finished. Then she asked very calmly, "Vivian, are you reading from something or are you coming up with this yourself?" The line went quiet. "Mom, Dad is just trying to—" "I heard you," Cordelia said. "Good night." She did not call back. She turned to the laptop screen and read the sentence from 1986 one more time, and then she closed the computer, and she sat in the dark motel room listening to the highway below and thinking about a drafting table and a roll of vellum and what it means to have once known exactly what you were for. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning, Cordelia drove back to Maple Ridge. Thaddeus had a site inspection in Conshohocken. She knew his calendar the way she knew every system in the house, because for 28 years, she had been the person who made both of them function. Rosa, the housekeeper, opened the door before Cordelia reached the top step. Rosa was a practical woman in her 50s who had worked for the household for 11 years, and she said nothing, only stepped aside. Her eyes were red. Cordelia knew exactly what she needed and exactly where it was. She climbed 3 flights of stairs to the attic. In the western corner, under 2 dead moths and a layer of dust thick enough to ride in, sat the cedar chest. On top of it, the frame photograph she had placed there herself. Vivian, at 3 years old, in the yellow dress, squinting into the August sun. Cordelia had set that photograph on top of the chest on the day she packed her drafting tools away in the autumn of 1995, and she had not opened the chest since. She lifted the photograph. She set it aside. The chest was heavier than she remembered. Getting it down 3 flights of narrow attic stairs took her 25 minutes. The turn at the second-floor landing was tight, and she had to tilt the chest 45 degrees and brace it against her left shoulder and her left knee, which had given her trouble since 2019, sent a long, clear signal of protest the entire way. She left a shallow gouge in the plaster of the stairwell wall. Rosa watched from the bottom landing and did not offer to help because she understood, as sensible people do, that there are things a person needs to carry themselves. Cordelia drove the chest back to the motel in the trunk of the Camry. She did not open it that night. She sat on the floor beside it and looked at it the way you look at something that might still bite. On Sunday morning, she lifted the lid. A life she had forgotten she owned. The drafting set in its mahogany case, pencils still sharp after 27 years. Because she had always bought good pencils. And good pencils do not forget what they are. 3 rolls of vellum drawings from her final studio at Cornell. A stack of sketchbooks. And at the bottom, in a navy cloth binding, her senior thesis. The Ethics of Restoration. What we owe the buildings we inherit. She sat with that title for a while. Beneath the thesis, in a manila envelope she did not remember placing there, a folded letter on cream-colored stationery, the handwriting looping and deliberate. The postmark, October 1994. The letter was from her mother's older sister, Eleanor Whitmore, who had died in 1997, at the age of 91, in a nursing home in Scranton. Cordelia had met her exactly once as a teenager, under protest, dragged along on a holiday obligation. She resented for reasons she could no longer remember. What she remembered of Eleanor was small and specific. Tall, thin, the posture of someone who had spent decades at a table where precision mattered. Hands with long fingers with ink stains at the knuckles that no amount of washing had ever fully removed. And the way she had looked at the sketchbook Cordelia had brought along. Not the way adults look at children's drawings with encouragement and pleasant lies, but the way one professional examines the work of another. Calibrating. Honest. The family did not speak of Eleanor except in the careful, lowered voices reserved for relatives they had decided not to love. Unmarried. No children. Rumored to have lived with a woman in Philadelphia during the 1930s. Cut from her father's will. Barely mentioned at holidays. Cordelia's mother had spoken of her only when she could not avoid it, and never with warmth. Cordelia read the letter 3 times. "My dear Cordelia," it began, "your mother tells me you are pregnant again and that your husband has asked you to stop drawing. She says this as though it were good news. I am writing to you because I was once a young woman who was asked to stop drawing, and I did. And it is the only decision of my life I would undo if I could. You are the only person in this family who ever asked to see my plans. I am leaving something to you, not to your mother, not to your brother, not to your children, to you." The paperwork is with a man named David Sullivan in Whitmore Falls, Pennsylvania. When the time comes that you need it, and only you will know when that is, go and ask him. He will explain. Until then, tell no one. They will try to talk you out of it. Your loving aunt. Paperclip to the second page was a business card. Kellerman and Sons 14. Front Street, Whitmore Falls, Pennsylvania. The card was 30 years old. Cordelia sat on the motel floor for an hour without moving. She had been 34 in 1994. Barrett was 4. Vivian was 1. She had not opened this letter until the morning after the autumn of her 64th year, sitting on a motel carpet in Riverside, surrounded by the evidence of a life she had stopped living while it was still happening. Eleanor had known something that Cordelia had not been willing to know, that there would come a time when the letter would be necessary, that only Cordelia would recognize that time when it arrived. She called the number on the card that afternoon. The man who answered, a quietly spoken 38-year-old named David Sullivan, went silent for several seconds when Cordelia said her name and her aunt's name in the same sentence. "There's a file," he said. "I've been waiting a long time. Can you come up Tuesday?" She had met Thaddeus Ashford in the spring of 1988, 3 months before her graduation from Cornell, at an engagement party on a rooftop in Old City. He was 29, already running a 2-truck demolition company that he was certain would become a construction empire inside a decade. He had a quality that Cordelia at 26 had misread as confidence, but that she now understood was simply the certainty of a man who has decided what he wants and begun assembling it. He had taken her hand at that party and looked at her fingers and said, "You have an architect's hands." She had received it as a compliment. She had been meant to. She had been accepted into the graduate program at Penn. She had been offered a junior drafting position at a boutique preservation firm in Center City, a firm run by two women who had met in school and spent 15 years building something precise and important. She had been in every measurable sense on her way. Thaddeus proposed 9 months after that rooftop. He told her she did not need graduate school, that she would learn more on real jobs than in any studio, that he was building something, and he wanted her inside it. She believed him. She believed the preservation firm would still be there in a year or two when the business was stable. She believed a great many things that had the shape of truth without the substance. Barrett was born in 1990. Vivian in 1993. The preservation firm, the one she had turned down, merged with a larger group in 1995. By 2005, it had become one of the most respected firms in Philadelphia. Its founding partners received the National Preservation Award in 2018. Cordelia read about it in a magazine in a dentist's waiting room and folded the magazine closed and set it face down on the end table, a gesture so quiet and complete that the woman sitting beside her did not notice. In 1992, Cordelia drafted the first commercial bid for Ashford Construction on the kitchen table. The contract was worth $340,000. The signature on the submission documents was Thaddeus Ashford's. The name of the person who drew every page of the proposal was nowhere on it. She drew the next one, and the one after that. By the time the company was incorporated, she had stopped signing her drawings. By the time they bought the house on Maple Ridge, she had packed her drafting tools into the cedar chest and placed the photograph of Vivian on top and walked downstairs to start dinner. And that had been that for 27 years, until a Sunday morning in a motel room, when she lifted the lid and found that the pencils were still sharp, and that knowledge, unlike so many other things, does not expire just because you stop using it. Whitmore Falls was 2 hours north on Route 476 into what people who lived in cities called the coal country, by which they meant the places that had been used up and left. The mountains turned from green to rust. The billboards thinned and then disappeared. The exits led to towns whose names Cordelia half remembered from high school history: Hazleton, Tamaqua, Shenandoah. She drove through all of them with the attention of someone who has spent 35 years understanding how buildings speak to the people who built them. These towns were honest rather than beautiful. Brick storefronts on main streets that were half empty but not abandoned. Churches painted with the care of people who have given up on many things but not on this. People had left, but the people who remained had not stopped caring. There was a dignity in that which Cordelia recognized. David Sullivan's office still had the name Kellerman painted on the window in gold leaf. He was younger than she expected, with the composed manner of someone who has handled other people's most consequential paperwork long enough to understand that his own reactions are beside the point. He set a folder on the desk between them that was thick enough that she had to hold it with both hands. Eleanor Whitmore had purchased the property in 1961. She had placed it in a private trust in 1994, structured to transfer to Cordelia upon her application and presentation of identification. Property taxes had been paid every year from a pre-funded escrow account. The house had not been legally occupied since 1972. It did not appear on the county's current municipal tax map, an error from a digitization project in 2003 that no one had corrected because no one had known to look. "Where is it?" Cordelia asked. 3 miles north, David said. "End of Whitmore Lane. You'll know when you see it." She drove. The road narrowed to a single lane, then to gravel, then to a rutted track through second-growth woods that closed over the car like a tunnel. Then the trees opened. The house was 3 stories of Victorian Queen Anne, with a wraparound porch that had collapsed on the eastern side, and a conical turret rising above the tree line, its slate tiles patched with moss. Its gingerbread trim rotted to something that looked almost like lace. The windows were boarded from the inside, with plywood gone gray from 50 years of weather. The whole structure leaned slightly to the southwest, but it had not fallen in 50 years of Pennsylvania winters and springs, and the particular cruelty of ice and old wood. It had not fallen. Behind the house, almost hidden in the overgrowth, a smaller building, square, carefully proportioned, with a gable roof and narrow windows placed at intervals that were not decorative, functional. The windows of someone who understood that light is a tool. Cordelia got out of the car and stood in the dead leaves. Before she could take 3 steps toward the house, another vehicle came down the lane behind her. A pickup truck, older and considerably less ceremonious than a Range Rover. The woman who climbed out was 58, compact, wearing a flannel work jacket and the expression of someone who has learned to be skeptical of strangers arriving in nice cars on roads where they have no business being. She did not offer her hand. "Carol Morrison," she said. "I'm the mayor. Orville at the hardware store mentioned someone had come up to see the Whitmore place." Cordelia Ashford. Carol looked at her, then at the house, then back. "We've had 3 buyers before you. First one sold it after 6 months. Second one applied for a demolition permit. Third one got the restoration estimate and disappeared." She said this without inflection, the way you state the terms of a recurring problem. "What are you planning to do with it?" Cordelia looked up at the turret, at the finial at its peak, which was still there. Original 60-year-old copper gone green, which meant whoever had put it there had built it to last, and had used the right materials and had known the difference. That finial meant something to her in a way she could not have explained quickly to someone who had not spent years understanding what buildings say when they are built with honesty. "I'm going to restore it," she said. Carol studied her for a moment with the careful attention of a person who has been disappointed by optimism before. "We'll see," she said. She got back in the truck and drove away without another word. Cordelia stood in the cold air for a while looking at the house. Then she took out her phone and called Vivian. Vivian answered on the second ring, and Cordelia said simply, "I'm keeping it. I'm going to restore it." There was a pause. Then Vivian laughed. Not cruelly, but with the gentle condescension of someone who is certain they are being reasonable. "Mom, you're 64. You can't even live there. There's no heat. There's no running water. You said it's falling apart. Take the property, sell it to whoever will buy it. Use the money for something that makes sense. I'm not selling it. Mom, this is what a breakdown looks like. Cordelia looked at the turret again, at the finial at the porch that had held for 50 years, even while it was collapsing, at the walls that leaned but had not failed. No, she said. This is exactly the opposite. She ended the call. She walked toward the house. She understood with the part of her brain that had spent 3 decades watching other people build things while she stood beside them, and said nothing, that the bones of this structure were sound. Walls standing, foundations solid, roof intact. Whatever had been done wrong over the years, the essential things had been done right. The rest was work. She knew how to do work. She spent 3 nights in the car, not because she was afraid of the house exactly. Cordelia had made enough decisions in her life to know the difference between fear and caution. And what kept her in the reclined driver's seat of the Camry with a gas station blanket across her lap was caution. You do not walk into a structure that has been sealed for 50 years and commit your body to it before you understand what you are dealing with. That was not timidity. That was the first principle of anyone who has ever worked with buildings seriously. Know what you have before you decide what to do with it. On the 4th morning, she drove to Frank Miller's hardware store on the main street of Whitmore Falls and bought a $14 crowbar. Frank was a man in his early 60s with sawdust on his forearms and the unhurried manner of someone who has been answering questions about tools for long enough that he no longer finds any questions surprising. He looked at the crowbar, looked at Cordelia, and said, "Back door over there swells in the lower hinge in cold weather. Try the upper frame first." He did not ask who she was. He did not ask what she was doing. He rang up the crowbar and went back to the inventory he had been doing when she walked in. The rear door of the house was solid oak, original to the structure, swollen in its frame from decades of freeze and thaw. Cordelia worked at it for 40 minutes with the crowbar in her shoulder, and at one point her foot braced against the doorframe in a way that would have embarrassed her in any other context. When it finally gave, it gave all at once, swinging inward with a low groan, and the smell that came out stopped her where she stood. Not rot. She had braced for rot. What came out instead was dry and ancient and somehow preserved. The smell of dust and cedar and old varnish and something mineral underneath it all. The ghost of coal smoke from a chimney that had not drawn in half a century. It was the smell of a room that had been waiting rather than dying. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before she stepped through. The interior did not look like abandonment. It looked like intention. Whoever had closed this house in 1972 had done it the right way. Not in haste, not in grief, but with the methodical care of someone who understood they were putting something down, that they wanted to still be there when someone picked it back up. The furniture was draped in muslin sheets gray with dust, but intact. The water valves had been shut at the main. The chimney flues were blocked. Every window boarded from the inside. The plaster walls were cracked in places but had not collapsed. The chestnut floors ran unbroken down a central hall 12 feet wide. Not the width of display, but the width of actual human movement, the width of someone who had thought about how people actually live in rooms. At the end of the hall, a curved staircase rose to a second-floor landing lit by a stained glass window she had not been able to see from outside. Geometric shapes in amber and deep green that threw colored light across the runner. When she wiped the dust from the glass with her sleeve, she climbed the stairs, slowly testing each tread before committing her weight. The banister was hand-turned. The newel post was a single piece of quarter-sawn oak with a small brass medallion set into the top. She bent close to read it. Scene 1894. She stood up. Eleanor Whitmore had been born in 1906. This house had been built in 1894. The initials matched. The family name matched. But the date made no sense unless Eleanor had bought a house built by someone who shared her initials, which was possible, or unless there was something about the name Whitmore Cordelia did not know, which felt standing on this landing in the cold-colored light considerably more likely. She filed the question and kept walking. The bedroom above the kitchen had the least water damage and a working flue. She cleaned it for 2 full days, bought a cot and a camp stove and a battery lantern and a 5-gallon water jug from Frank Miller's store, and moved in. Frank watched her purchases accumulate over 3 separate visits, and on the third one finally spoke. "You're staying out there, aren't you?" It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," Cordelia said. He wrote a phone number on a receipt and slid it across the counter. "That's my cell. If your propane runs low in the night, call. I keep a spare tank in the back." She took the number and put it in her pocket, and that was the beginning of the only friendship she would have in Whitmore Falls for the first several weeks. On the 5th day, Cordelia was standing in the kitchen, trying to determine whether the cast-iron sink could be salvaged when she heard tires on the gravel drive. A Subaru wagon, dented in a way that suggested long and unconcerned use, stopped at the edge of the property. A man in his early 70s climbed out. Silver hair, cut close, steel-rimmed glasses, a thermos in one hand, and a clipboard in the other. He did not come toward her. He stood at the edge of the drive and looked up at the turret, with the specific concentration of someone reading something in a language they know well. "Philadelphia, Queen Anne," he said to the turret more than to her. 1890s, probably commissioned by one of the mine operators, most likely. "Your conical turret still has its original finial. I can see it from here. Whoever built this knew what they were doing, and whoever maintained it loved it." He introduced himself when she came out to meet him. Thomas Crawford, retired from the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission Preservation Field Office. 31 years. His wife had died 2 years ago. He had been looking, he said, for something to pay attention to. "I heard in town there was a woman restoring the Whitmore place alone," he said. "I had to come see." He held up the thermos. "I brought coffee. I'm not asking to help. I'm asking to look." Cordelia studied him for a moment. There was something in his face that she had not seen in a long time. A directness about his own situation, that carried no apology and required no response. He was a man who had lost something enormous and had decided apparently to keep working. She recognized that. "Come in," she said. "Mind the third floorboard in the foyer. It needs replacing." He walked the house for 2 hours. He ran his palm along the banister. He crouched at the newel post and read the brass medallion. He measured the hall width with a laser tool he produced from his jacket pocket. He tapped the plaster in 4 rooms and listened to each tap with his head tilted slightly, the posture of a doctor listening to a chest. When he came back out to where Cordelia was repacking her toolbox, his face had changed. "Cordelia," he said, "this house is nationally significant. Do you understand that I know it's old? It is not just old, it is intact. I have surveyed close to 800 Queen Anne structures in this state over my career. I've never seen one with original hardware, original glass, original floors, original turret, finial, original interior trim, and original stained glass all present in the same building. This is a time capsule." He stopped, and whoever designed it was operating at a level of craft that very few builders in this region ever achieved. "Her name was Eleanor Whitmore," Cordelia said. "She was my great-aunt. She designed more than 100 buildings in Pennsylvania and was never credited for a single one of them." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "Show me." She took him to the carriage house. The structure sat 30 feet behind the main house, its proportions too deliberate for storage, its north-facing window too large for any agricultural purpose. Cordelia had been looking at it since the day she arrived. She had been saving it. She had understood without being able to say exactly why that the carriage house was not where you started. It was where you went when you were ready. The door was secured with a cast-iron padlock that Frank, when she described it, identified as manufactured between 1935 and 1950, probably a Corbin. He told her the best approach was to cut through the shackle rather than attack the lock body. She bought a bolt cutter and spent an afternoon on it and came away with 2 new bruises on her right hand and the door open. She was not prepared for what was inside. The floor was chestnut, the same chestnut as the main house, the same cut, the same grade, laid by the same hands. The north-facing window was the size of a door paned with wavy handmade glass that softened the light into something diffuse and even, the kind of light that does not cast shadows. Along the back wall, a drafting table ran the full width of the room. Not a table that had been moved in from somewhere else. A table built into the wall at a height calibrated for someone who preferred to work standing. Built-in shelves on the right wall held rolled plans, dozens of them each tied with brown twine, arranged by what appeared to be date. On the wall above the drafting table, a framed diploma. School of Architecture, University of Pennsylvania, 1929. Eleanor Whitmore, first woman admitted to the program. Thesis distinction. Cordelia sat down on the floor. She had not known. No one had told her. Her own mother, Eleanor's sister, had gone to her grave without once saying the word architect in connection with her older sibling. Eleanor had walked the halls of Penn's architecture program in 1929 as the first woman ever admitted. and not one person in Cordelia's family had thought to mention it. Not one had thought it worth preserving. She untied the first roll of plans. Elevations for a small bank building in Reading. 1933. The draftsmanship was clean and assured, the kind of line work that comes from a hand that has stopped second-guessing itself. In the lower right corner, a signature, E. Whitmore, and below it a stamp, designed under the supervision of, followed by two names, male names, names from firms she vaguely recognized. She untied a second roll. A schoolhouse in Wilston, 1937. Same formula. A third. A department store in Scranton, 1940. Same. She opened roll after roll and found the same thing each time. A body of work spanning 3.5 decades. Building after building. The lines unmistakably hers. The handwriting matching the letter in Cordelia's trunk exactly. And every single one of them attributed to men who had not drawn them. Thomas stood in front of the framed diploma without speaking. Then he walked to the shelves and touched the end of one of the rolled plans with the tips of his fingers, the way a person touches something they are afraid of disturbing. "May I?" She nodded. He untied 4 rolls and spread them across the drafting table and studied them with his glasses pushed up on his forehead and his face 6 inches from the paper. When he finished, he sat down on the stool and placed both hands flat on the table. "Cordelia," he said, "I know 3 of these buildings. The Wilston Schoolhouse. I surveyed it in 1998. It has been on the National Register since 1995. The firm of record is Caldwell and Penrose." He looked up. "In the entire preservation literature of this state, there has never been a single mention of the name Eleanor Whitmore." "That's what I thought." "This is not a restoration project anymore," he said. "This is a recovery. For her." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you want help?" "Yes." He nodded once, the kind of nod a person gives when they have just agreed to something that will take a long time and cost more than anticipated, and is worth it regardless. "I'll come 3 days a week," he said. "I bring my own lunch. I have opinions, but I'll keep them unless you ask." Cordelia sat on the chestnut floor for a long time after he left. When she finally cried, it was not for herself. She had been holding that grief in reserve and had not quite known it. She cried for the woman who had set a chair at a drafting table in this room and spent 35 years drawing buildings she would never be credited for, and who had written a letter to a niece she barely knew and asked across 30 years one quiet thing: "Come and look." The assessment took the better part of a month. Cordelia moved through every room with a clipboard and her drafting pencils measuring, sketching, noting. She did not work from emotion. She worked from method. The proportions of the rooms were not the showy proportions of the pattern book. Victorians she had studied at Cornell, the houses built to announce wealth rather than enable life. These rooms were sized for people. Ceilings high enough to breathe, but not so high that the heat disappeared in winter. Windows placed for cross ventilation in summer, for solar gain in the cold months. Whoever had designed this house had thought about the people who would inhabit it across seasons and decades on ordinary Tuesdays. The mechanical systems were a different story. The wiring was knob and tube original and completely unacceptable by any standard developed in the last 50 years. The boiler in the basement dated to the Eisenhower administration and had not been operational since the house closed. The well pump had seized solid. She made lists. She priced materials through Frank's store, paying in amounts she could manage because she could not manage large ones. And she learned what she did not know by sitting in the diner on Main Street where the Wi-Fi was free and watching instructional videos on her laptop until the waitress refilled her coffee without being asked, which was a form of welcome she accepted gratefully. Thomas came back on a Wednesday with a pickup truck full of tools and a work light that ran off a generator. He set up behind the carriage house without asking permission. He did not treat her like a student. He treated her like what she was, the architect of record on a complex preservation job. And when other people were around, he addressed her as Miss Ashford, which was more than most people had given her in 30 years. He taught her to read the plaster cracks, showed her how to distinguish between structural movement and cosmetic failure, how to feel along a seam with her fingertips, and know whether the lath beneath had separated from the studs, or whether the damage was only surface deep. "You have good hands for this," he said on the fourth day, watching her trace a hairline fracture above the dining room window. "Most people I train take 3 months to read a joint like that." She did not tell him that she had been reading joints and load paths and the language of structural stress since she was 22 years old, that she had simply forgotten she knew how. Some knowledge does not expire. It only waits. By the end of the second week, she had moved into the bedroom above the kitchen on a more permanent basis. The cot was uncomfortable, but the room was dry and the chimney drew cleanly. Once she had cleared the flue of 50 years of bird nests and debris. She slept with her coat on and woke before dawn to the sound of Thomas's truck on the gravel. They worked without much conversation. He would point to a section of crown molding that needed stabilization, or a windowsill that showed signs of rot, and she would measure and calculate and write the specifications in the same careful hand she had used to draft elevations on the kitchen table at Maple Ridge while her children slept. The glazing compound came in 5-pound cans from a supplier in Scranton that Thomas knew from 3 decades of field work. She watched 40 instructional videos in the diner over the course of a week, taking notes in a spiral notebook like a student preparing for an exam, and then she reglazed the first window on the south facade, with Thomas standing behind her, saying nothing, watching. It took her 2 hours. When she finished, she stepped back and looked at what she had done. The glass sat clean in its frame, the putty pressed smooth against the muntins, the whole assembly tight and square and weatherproof. Thomas walked up to the window and ran his thumb along the bead. "That's professional work," he said. She reglazed 11 more windows over the next 3 weeks. By the 8th one, she no longer needed to refer to her notes. By the 12th, her hands remembered what to do before her mind had to think about it. The chimney pointing was harder. The mortar had to be mixed to a specific consistency, softer than modern formulations, compatible with the original lime-based matrix that the bricks had been bedded in 130 years ago. She ordered the first batch from a masonry supplier in Allentown and mixed it according to the ratio Thomas gave her, and climbed the ladder to the roofline with a trowel and a hawk. The mortar was wrong, too stiff. It would not pack into the joints without crumbling, and after 40 minutes of fighting it, she climbed back down and dumped the entire batch and started over. Thomas watched from the ground without comment. When she came down the second time, he handed her a cup of coffee from his thermos. "Lime mortar has a learning curve," he said. "Took me 6 tries the first time I mixed it. You'll get it." She got it on the third batch, spent 4 days on the north chimney packing mortar into the joints with the edge of the trowel, striking it smooth, cleaning the excess from the brick faces with a damp sponge. It was repetitive work, the kind that allowed the mind to go quiet while the hands stayed busy. And by the end of the 4th day, her right shoulder ached, and her left knee sent sharp signals every time she climbed the ladder. But the chimney was sound. She stood in the yard at dusk and looked up at the roofline and felt something she had not felt in a very long time: the satisfaction of work done correctly, of a problem identified and solved with her own competence. Thomas came out of the house with his coat on, ready to leave for the day. "You did good work up there," he said, following her gaze to the chimney. "That'll hold another 100 years." It was in the 3rd week, while Cordelia was on her knees in the front hall, pulling up a section of damaged floorboard, that Thomas called from the 2nd floor. "Cordelia, you need to see this." She climbed the stairs and found him standing at the landing window with his phone in his hand, reading something on the screen. "I've been going through the county property records," he said, "for the National Register application. I wanted to verify the construction date." He turned the phone toward her. It was a scan of an old document. The ink faded to brown, the handwriting precise and formal in the style of the late 19th century. "Property survey and deed of transfer," it read. "Whitmore Residence, Whitmore Lane. Constructed 1894. Designed and built by Catherine Whitmore, architect." Cordelia read it 3 times. "Catherine Whitmore," she said quietly. "Eleanor's maternal grandmother," Thomas said. "I checked the genealogy records. Catherine was born in 1868, died in 1922. She designed and built this house when she was 26 years old." He looked at Cordelia. "Your great-great-grandmother was an architect in 1894 in Coal Country, Pennsylvania. And she built this house with her own hands." Cordelia sat down on the top step of the staircase. "Catherine built the house in 1894. Eleanor bought her grandmother's house in 1961. 67 years later, Eleanor had come home, had walked into the rooms her grandmother designed, and understood, perhaps for the first time in her life, that she was not the first woman in the family to be erased. 3 generations, 3 architects, 3 women whose names had been systematically removed from the record until someone came looking. "The medallion on the newel post," Cordelia said. "Scene 1894. I thought it was Eleanor's initials, but it's not. It's Catherine's." Thomas said. This was her house, her work, and she signed it right there in brass, where anyone who cared to look could see it. Cordelia stood up and walked down the stairs to the newel post. She placed her hand on the brass medallion, felt the raised letters under her palm. Seen. Catherine Whitmore, 1894. A woman who had built a house in an era when women were not permitted to build houses, who had carved her initials into the structure itself, as proof that she had been here, that she had done this work, that her hands and her mind had made something real. And then the world had forgotten her anyway. Cordelia stood there for a long time, with her hand on the medallion. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "We're going to make sure people remember," she said. All three of them, Catherine, Eleanor, and everyone who comes after. The letter from Ashford Construction's legal counsel arrived on a Tuesday in late September, delivered by certified mail to the Whitmore Falls post office. Cordelia signed for it standing at the counter while Frank Miller watched from behind the register of the hardware store next door. She did not open it until she was back at the house sitting at Eleanor's drafting table in the carriage house with the autumn light coming through the wavy glass. The letter was from a firm in Philadelphia. Clifford Drummond, Esquire, on behalf of his client, Thaddeus Ashford. It alleged fraudulent concealment of a material inheritance asset during divorce proceedings. It alleged improper application of settlement funds to acquire a property of undisclosed significant value. It requested in language that was carefully legal and utterly clear a constructive trust over a percentage of the appreciated value of the Whitmore property. Cordelia read it twice. Then she called David Sullivan. He answered on the second ring, and she read him the letter word for word. When she finished, there was a pause. "He won't win," David said. "The trust was established in 1994, 30 years before your divorce. The property transfer is clean. Your settlement was final and unconditional. He has no legal standing." "But," Cordelia said because she could hear the unspoken word in his voice. "But he doesn't need to win," David said quietly. "He needs you to run out of money before a judge tells him no. Responding to this will cost approximately $4,000. If he files follow-up motions, each one will cost the same. Your East Wing restoration budget, the one you set aside for winter weatherproofing, that's going to legal fees now. And he knows it." Cordelia sat at the drafting table and looked at the rolled plans on the shelves. 35 years of Eleanor's work attributed to men who had not earned it. 35 years of her own work, signed with someone else's name. "Then we fight it," she said. "Cordelia." "I know what it costs," she said. "I've always known what it costs. Draft the response. I'll find the money." She hung up and sat in the silence of the carriage house for a long time. Then she opened her laptop and looked at her bank account. The $47,000 settlement had diminished to $31,000. The East Wing needed $12,000 in materials and labor. Before the first hard freeze which the Farmer's Almanac predicted for mid-November, the math was not difficult. It was simply unforgiving. She closed the laptop and went back to work on the house. Thomas arrived the next morning and found her on a ladder in the front hall, scraping 50 years of paint buildup from the original beadboard ceiling. He set his toolbox down and looked up at her. "How bad is it?" he said. She had not told him about the letter, but Thomas Crawford had spent 31 years reading buildings, and 20 of those years reading the people who worked on them. And he could see the arithmetic in her face. "Bad enough that I'm going to need to postpone the East Wing," she said. He nodded once, did not ask for details, did not offer advice, just picked up his toolbox and carried it to the kitchen and started working on the window casings that needed reinforcement before winter. That was the thing about Thomas. He understood that some problems you solve by working and some problems you solve by giving someone space to work through them on their own. Carol Morrison came back in the third week of October. She arrived on a Tuesday with an envelope from the mayor's office, a formal notice requiring a structural safety inspection before the property could be certified for legal occupancy. The notice was legitimate. The timing and the manner of its delivery were not. Cordelia read it standing on the porch, and then looked at Carol with the composure of a woman who has survived a divorce attorney, reading the terms of her dismissal without blinking. 10 days, Cordelia said. I'll have the inspection results. Then she said, "Would you like to see what I've done so far?" Carol had not expected that. She followed Cordelia inside with the careful posture of someone who has been surprised and does not want to show it. She walked through the ground floor without speaking. She looked at the chestnut floors cleaned to their original color, the grain visible again after decades under grime and wax buildup. She looked at the windows. Cordelia had reglazed 12 of them now. The glass sitting plumb in frames that had been carefully shimmed and leveled. She looked at the chimney pointing Cordelia had done herself over 4 days with mortar she had mixed 3 times before getting it right. When they came back out to the porch, Carol stopped and turned to face the house. "You're really doing this," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Cordelia said. Carol looked at her for a moment and something in her expression shifted. Not warmth, not yet, but the skepticism had moved into something more like watchfulness, the look of someone recalibrating an assumption. "I'll send the inspector Friday," she said. Her voice was different. The inspector came on Friday morning. He was a man in his 50s with a clipboard and a level and a moisture meter, and he spent 4 hours going through the house room by room testing floor joists and checking plumb lines and making notes that Cordelia could not see. When he finished, he stood in the front hall and looked at his clipboard for a long time. "Structurally sound," he said finally. "Better than most houses I inspect that people are currently living in. Your chimney work is professional grade. Your window restoration is textbook. Whoever taught you knew what they were doing." "I taught myself," Cordelia said, "from videos and a lot of trial and error." The inspector looked at her with something that might have been respect. "You did good work," he said. He signed the form and handed her a copy. "You're certified for occupancy. Tell Carol I said so." After he left, Cordelia sat on the porch steps in the October sun and allowed herself for the first time in weeks to feel something close to relief. The house was sound. The work was good. Whatever happened with the legal battle, whatever Thaddeus tried to take from her, she had built something here that could not be undone. The second motion from Clifford Drummond arrived 3 days later, and the third one a week after that, and the fourth one 10 days after that. By the end of October, David Sullivan had responded to 4 separate filings, each one more procedurally complex than the last. Each one designed to consume time and money and attention. Cordelia's settlement account had dropped to $23,000. The east wing remained untouched, and the weather was turning cold. Barrett called on a Thursday evening in early November. It was the first time Cordelia had heard from him in over a year. "Mom," he said, and his voice had the careful neutrality of someone delivering a message they have been asked to deliver. "This needs to stop. You're being vindictive. You're damaging the family over a piece of property that no reasonable person would consider worth the fight." Cordelia set down the trowel she had been using to patch a section of plaster in the dining room. She walked out to the porch and stood in the cold November air. "Barrett," she said quietly, "the last time I saw you in person, you were standing on the porch of a house I kept for 28 years, and you did not pick up a single bag." She let that sit for a moment. "I am not trying to punish your father. I am trying to keep what belongs to me. Those are not the same thing." There was silence on the other end of the line. She could hear him breathing, could picture him standing in his office in his father's building, trying to find the words that would make this easier for everyone except her. "He's my boss, Mom," Barrett said finally. "I know." Cordelia said, "I've always known." She ended the call and stood on the porch looking out at the yard, where the leaves had turned and begun to fall. The space between her and her son, which had been closing for years, had closed the rest of the way in that silence. Barrett did not call again. Thomas found her on the porch 10 minutes later, standing in the dusk with her arms crossed against the cold. "You all right?" he asked. "No," she said, "but I will be." He nodded, stood beside her for a while without saying anything. Then he went back inside to finish the trim work he had been doing in the library. That was the thing about Thomas. He knew when to stay and when to give space, and he never confused the two. The Range Rover arrived on a Saturday morning in mid-November. Cordelia heard it before she saw it. The particular note of a V8 engine on a gravel road, unhurried and certain of itself. The sound of a vehicle that belongs in places it has no business being. She was on the wraparound porch, scraping the last of the lead paint from the original beadboard ceiling, when Thaddeus parked with one tire on the grass. A small, unconscious statement she recognized from 35 years of watching him treat other people's property as an extension of his own convenience. He got out in loafers and a navy quarter zip and sunglasses that cost more than her propane bill for the winter. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at the house with the same expression he applied to every job site he had ever visited. The expression of a man calculating extraction value. "Cordelia," he said, "you've been busy." She did not come down from the stepladder, did not set down the scraper. "Orville at the hardware store gave me directions," he said. Most people in town seem to know you." "Yes," she said. "May I come up? You may stand where you are." He tried the expression she had once a long time ago been susceptible to, the one that softened his face into something that looked like self-awareness. It had stopped working on her in the early years of the last decade, and it did not work now. He said he had heard about the Eleanor Whitmore find, said it was genuinely impressive, said he wanted to be practical with her. "Developers who specialize in heritage tourism are already paying attention," he said. "I have relationships in that space. I could help you move the property at a serious number. Friendly terms. Broker's fee only." "How much do you think it's worth?" Cordelia asked. "Depending on condition and National Register timing, 800,000 to 900,000. Maybe 1.2 million to the right buyer on the right day." "It's currently appraised at 1.7 million, Cordelia said. "And it's not for sale. Not to you. Not to your contacts. Not to anyone." She kept scraping paint while she spoke, did not look at him. "The Eleanor Whitmore Archive is going to operate out of the carriage house as a permanent educational facility. The Heritage Hollow Preservation Guild is signing a 40-year stewardship partnership with me next month. The property is going into an irrevocable preservation trust that legally prevents its sale for profit." She watched his face change. She had watched that face change across a kitchen island for 35 years, whenever a deal moved in a direction he had not anticipated. The pleasantness dissolved, and the thing underneath it, the thing that had built an empire by ensuring he never lost a negotiation, came forward in its place. "You bought this property with marital assets," he said. "I bought it with my divorce settlement, final and unconditional. My attorneys see it differently. Then they can say so to David Sullivan." He put the sunglasses back on. He walked to the Range Rover without another word and drove away down the gravel lane with the unhurried certainty of a man who has not yet admitted he is lost. Cordelia watched the lane until the sound of the engine was gone. Then she looked at her right hand, which was holding the paint scraper, and she told it to stop trembling. And after a moment it did. She went back to work on the beadboard. 9 days later, the certified letter arrived. David read it to her by phone in a voice that was steady and deliberate and gave away nothing. Motion to compel forensic accounting of marital asset distribution. Motion for preliminary injunction against property transfer. Motion to establish constructive trust, pending final determination of asset ownership. "He filed all three at once," David said. "It's a saturation strategy. He's trying to drown you in procedure." "How much?" Cordelia asked. "To respond to all three 12,000. Maybe 15 if he files opposition briefs, which he will." Cordelia sat at Eleanor's drafting table. She looked at the rolled plans on the shelves, at the diploma on the wall at the window, with its wavy handmade glass through which the light came in even and shadowless and without judgment. She thought about what it had cost Eleanor to draw 35 years of buildings and sign none of them. She thought about what it would cost her if she let Thaddeus attach his name to this place in any form. She thought about the letter that had waited 30 years in a cedar chest for the right morning to be opened. "Then we fight it," she said. "Cordelia, your winter budget." "I know," she said. "Draft the responses. I'll find the money." That evening, Thomas arrived with 2 grocery bags and a bottle of wine. He set them on the kitchen counter and started unpacking without asking permission. "You're going to eat something," he said, "and you're going to sit down while you do it. And then we're going to talk about how to finish the east wing before the first hard freeze." "Thomas, I can't afford." "I know," he said. "That's why we're going to do it ourselves. You, me, and Frank, who offered to help when I mentioned it to him this morning. We've got 3 weeks before the weather turns. That's enough time if we work smart." Cordelia sat at the kitchen table and watched him cook. Something simple, pasta with vegetables and olive oil, but he moved through the space with the ease of someone who has spent years cooking for 2 and has not yet learned to adjust the portions. They ate in silence for a while. Then Thomas poured 2 glasses of wine and handed one to her. "You know what I learned in 31 years of preservation work," he said. "The buildings that survive aren't the ones that never get damaged. They're the ones that get repaired by people who refuse to let them fall." He raised his glass. "You're one of those people, Cordelia. And that house is going to stand because of it." She raised her glass and drank and felt something in her chest that had been tight for months begin very slowly to loosen. The next 3 weeks were a controlled sprint against the calendar. Thomas showed up every morning at 7. Frank came after closing the store at 6. They worked by work lights when the daylight failed, installing vapor barrier and insulation in the east wing walls, replacing rotted sill plates, reinforcing the floor joists that had been compromised by 50 years of water infiltration. Cordelia learned to use a pneumatic nail gun and a reciprocating saw. She learned to read a framing square and cut studs to length, and install them plumb between sole plate and top plate. She learned that her knee, which had been protesting since September, would continue to work if she simply ignored the signals it was sending and kept moving. On the 18th day, the first snow fell. They finished the last section of wall sheathing at 9 o'clock at night, working under halogen floods. And when Frank drove the final nail and stepped back, all 3 of them stood in the November cold, looking at what they had built. "That'll hold," Frank said, and it would. The east wing was weather-tight. The structure was sound. Whatever the winter brought, the house would survive it. Cordelia stood in the yard after Thomas and Frank had gone, looking up at the turret against the night sky, at the windows she had reglazed at the chimney. She had pointed at the east wing that now stood secure against the cold. She had built this, not alone, but she had been the architect, the one who made the decisions and carried the weight and refused to let it fall. And whatever Thaddeus took from her bank account, whatever motions his lawyers filed, whatever Barrett chose to believe about who deserved what, he could not take this from her. The house stood. The work was good. And that, she thought, was a kind of winning that had nothing to do with courts or money or other people's opinions. She went inside and slept better than she had in months. The storm came on a Tuesday night in the second week of December. The Weather Service had been tracking it for 3 days. a low-pressure system moving down from Canada with the particular intensity that produces ice rather than snow. The kind of storm that breaks tree limbs and pulls down power lines and finds every weakness in a structure that has stood for 130 years. Cordelia had been watching the forecasts. She had moved the camp stove and the water jugs to the bedroom above the kitchen. She had checked the chimney flue and made sure the wood stove was drawing cleanly. She had done everything a reasonable person could do to prepare for a night without power, in a house that was still in many ways held together by determination and good intentions. Thomas had driven up that afternoon with a load of firewood and a battery-powered radio. "You should come stay at my place," he said, stacking the wood by the kitchen door. "I've got a generator, heat, running water." "I'll be fine," Cordelia said. He looked at her for a long moment the way he looked at a wall he was trying to decide whether to trust. "The east wing is weather-tight," he said, "but that gutter system on the north side is original, 130 years old. If ice accumulates and pulls it loose, you're going to have water in the wall cavity. And if that water freezes—" "I know," Cordelia said. "All right," he said. He wrote a number on a piece of paper and set it on the kitchen table. "That's my cell. If anything happens, you call. I can be here in 20 minutes. She took the paper and put it in her pocket, and he left before the storm arrived. The ice started at 9 o'clock. Not snow, but freezing rain, the kind that hits surfaces already below freezing and turns instantly to glass. Cordelia sat by the wood stove in the bedroom and listened to it hitting the windows, a sound like small stones thrown in handfuls against the panes. By 11 o'clock, the power went out. She had expected that. She lit the battery lantern and added another log to the fire, and tried to read a book she had found in the carriage house, a technical manual on Victorian-era construction methods that Eleanor had annotated in the margins. At 1:40 in the morning, she heard the sound, not loud, not dramatic, just a crack sharp and clean like a rifle shot in the distance. She was out of bed before she fully understood what she had heard. She grabbed the flashlight and went to the window that looked north toward the east wing. The beam of the flashlight caught the gutter system, and she saw immediately what had happened. The ice had accumulated along the entire length of the north-facing gutter, hundreds of pounds of it, and the weight had torn the mounting brackets loose from the fascia board. The gutter hung at a 45-degree angle, and water was pouring from the break directly into the wall cavity below. Cordelia stood at the window and did the math. The outside temperature was 28 degrees. The water pouring into the wall would freeze within hours. And when water freezes, it expands. The expansion would crack. The sheathing split. The studs destroy 3 weeks of work and $12,000 in materials that she no longer had to replace. She looked at the clock. 1:43 a.m. She looked at the phone number Thomas had left on the kitchen table. She looked back out the window at the water pouring into the wall. Then she went downstairs and put on her coat and her work boots and the leather gloves she used for rough carpentry. She opened the door to the shed, where Thomas kept the ladders, and pulled out the extension ladder, 24 feet of aluminum that was heavier than she remembered. The ladder slipped twice on the ice-covered ground before she got it positioned against the north wall. She tested the first 3 rungs with her weight, felt them flex but hold, and started to climb. The wind hit her at the roofline. Not strong, but steady and cold enough to cut through her coat like it was paper. The ice on the rungs made every handhold uncertain. Her knee, which had been sending warning signals since September, sent something sharper now, something that felt less like caution and more like structural failure. She ignored it. The gutter was worse up close. 2 of the mounting brackets had sheared completely off. A third was hanging by a single screw. The entire assembly was gonna come down if she did not do something in the next few minutes. She had brought rope and a tarp. She secured the rope to the gutter at 3 points using the kind of knot she had learned from watching riggers work on construction sites 30 years ago. She pulled the tarp over the break in the gutter and lashed it down with more rope working by flashlight. Her hands numb inside the gloves. It was not a permanent fix. It was barely a temporary fix. But it would keep the water out of the wall cavity until morning, and morning was all she needed. The ladder slipped when she was 6 rungs from the ground. Not far. Maybe 6 inches. But enough that her weight shifted wrong, and her bad knee took the impact. And something in the joint made a sound she felt more than heard. She held onto the ladder and did not fall and did not cry out. And after a moment, the worst of the pain subsided into something she could work through. She made it to the ground, dragged the ladder back to the shed, walked to the kitchen door, and went inside and sat down at the table and allowed herself for exactly 1 minute to acknowledge what her body was telling her. Then she stood up and went back to bed and slept for 3 hours. Thomas found her the next morning standing in the yard, looking up at the tarp on the north gutter. The sun was out. The ice was already starting to melt. The tarp was holding. He got out of his truck and walked over to where she stood and followed her gaze up to the roofline. "You went up there," he said. It was not a question. "Yes. In an ice storm. At 2 in the morning. On an extension ladder. Yes." He looked at the tarp. Looked at the rope work, the knots tied correctly, the whole assembly secured in a way that would have been professional under ideal conditions, and was something close to miraculous given the circumstances. "Where did you learn to rig like that?" he asked. "I spent 35 years on construction sites," Cordelia said. "I watched. I learned." He turned to look at her, and his face was careful the way it got when he was trying not to say something he thought she already knew. "Cordelia, you could have died. I could have lost the house." He stood there for a moment looking at her. Then he shook his head, not in disapproval, but in something that looked like recognition. "You're not doing this alone anymore," he said. "I'm moving my tools here tomorrow. We're finishing that gutter system before the next storm. And you're gonna let me help. Because if you go up another ladder in the middle of the night and break your neck, I'm going to feel responsible." She wanted to argue, but her knee was swollen and her hands had blisters from the rope, and she was 64 years old and tired in a way that sleep would not fix. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They went inside and he made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table. and planned the work that needed to be done before winter settled in for good. It was on a Thursday afternoon 2 weeks later, sitting at Eleanor's drafting table while Thomas replaced rotted trim in the dining room, that Cordelia had the thought that would change everything. She had been looking at the legal filings from Clifford Drummond, trying to make sense of the strategy. 7 motions filed over 4 months, each one more procedurally complex than the last. Each one designed to consume time and money and force her into a settlement she did not want to make. The argument was always the same: that she had concealed a material asset during the divorce proceedings, that the Whitmore property represented value that should have been disclosed and divided, that Thaddeus was entitled to compensation for his portion of the marital estate that had funded the acquisition. But that was not true. The settlement had been final. The money had been hers, and the property had come from a trust established 30 years before the divorce. A trust that had nothing to do with Thaddeus or his company, or the 35 years she had spent building his reputation, one unsigned drawing at a time. She sat up straight. The 35 years of unsigned drawings. She opened her laptop, pulled up the Ashford Construction website, and navigated to the portfolio page. Project after project, photographs of commercial buildings and retail centers and mixed-use developments, each one accompanied by a description of scope and scale and design excellence. She started taking screenshots, saved them in a folder, opened a spreadsheet and began making a list. Hampton Square Retail Center, 1992. She had drafted that proposal on the kitchen table over 11 days, while Barrett slept in a bouncer at her feet. She could still see the elevations in her mind, could remember the exact configuration of the parking layout, and the way she had calculated the sight lines from the street. Riverside Commons, 1995. 3 weeks of work. Vivian had been 2 years old. Cordelia had worked at night after the children were asleep, and she had drawn every structural detail by hand because Thaddeus had not yet computerized the office. Chestnut Hill Medical Plaza, 1998. Iron Hill Corporate Center, 2001. Broad Street Station renovation, 2005. She went through them one by one, cross-referencing with the old calendars she had kept in the cedar chest. The ones where she had tracked project deadlines and client meetings, and the hours she had spent at the drafting table while Thaddeus put his signature on the submission documents. By the time she finished, it was dark outside. Thomas had gone home. The house was quiet. She looked at the spreadsheet. 37 major projects between 1992 and 2005. An estimated 11,400 hours of architectural work. Market rate for architectural services conservatively $85 per hour. The total came to $969,000. She sat back in the chair. Thaddeus was suing her for a portion of the $47,000 settlement, claiming it represented marital assets used to acquire hidden value. But he owed her $969,000 for 35 years of unpaid architectural work. Work that had built his company. Work that had made his reputation. Work that he had signed his name to and taken credit for while she packed the drafting tools away and made dinner. She called David Sullivan. He answered on the first ring, and she could hear the television in the background, the voices muted and distant. "David," she said, "I need to file a counterclaim." There was a pause. "What kind of counterclaim?" "Thaddeus claims I concealed assets, but I can prove he owes me $969,000 for architectural services rendered between 1992 and 2005. Every project he signed, every proposal he submitted. I drafted them. I can document the hours. I can prove the work was mine. And I can show that he never paid me a single dollar for any of it." David was quiet for a long moment. "You're going to use architectural forensics as a legal weapon," he said. "Yes. Cordelia, this is brilliant. If you can document it, if you can prove the drafting style is uniquely yours, this flips the entire case. He's not the injured party claiming hidden assets. He's the defendant owing unpaid wages. The optics alone—" "I can prove it," Cordelia said. "I have my Cornell portfolio. I have the calendars with project deadlines. I have photographs of some of the original drawings before they were submitted. The line work is mine. Anyone with eyes can see it." "Send me everything you have," David said. "I'll start drafting the counterclaim tonight." She hung up and sat at the drafting table for a long time, looking at the spreadsheet on the screen. $969,000. 35 years. 11,400 hours. It was not about the money. It had never been about the money. It was about the work itself. The thousands of hours she had spent translating vision into form, solving problems, making decisions that would affect how people move through space and how buildings stood against weather and time. Work that had mattered. Work that had been good. Work that had been hers. And now, finally, she was going to put her name on it. The reporter arrived on a Saturday morning in early January. Cordelia was in the carriage house cataloging Eleanor's plans when she heard the car on the gravel drive. A Honda Civic with Pennsylvania plates and a campus parking sticker from a university she did not recognize. The woman who got out was 34, wearing a canvas jacket and jeans, and carrying a leather messenger bag that looked like it had been everywhere twice. She walked up to the porch where Cordelia stood and held out her hand. "Ramona Kettner," she said. "I'm a freelance journalist. I've been following the Eleanor Whitmore story for about 3 weeks, and I drove 4 hours to get here. Because I think this is important and I don't trust myself to do it justice over the phone." Cordelia almost sent her away. She had done no press. She had been building this thing in the particular privacy of people who are not sure what they have yet and do not want to explain it before they understand it themselves. But Ramona was already talking. "I found the obituary of Eleanor's thesis advisor in the Penn archives last week," she said. "Professor Hamilton Crawford. He died in 1962. But there's a letter in the collection written 6 months before he died to a colleague. In it, he calls Eleanor Whitmore the most gifted student he ever taught. Says she had a grasp of spatial relationships and structural logic that exceeded anyone he'd encountered in 40 years of teaching. That letter has never been published. I don't think anyone's read it in 60 years. She stopped and looked at Cordelia with an intensity that was not aggressive, just focused in the way of someone who has decided a thing matters and will not be talked out of it. For 64 years, no one has printed her name in connection with her work, Ramona said. Give me 2 days. Let me see what you've found. Let me talk to you about your own story about what you're doing here. Let me try. Cordelia looked at her for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. Come in, she said. Ramona stayed for 8 hours. She photographed the diploma on the wall of the carriage house. She photographed the rolled plans with their stamps, attributing Eleanor's work to men who had not earned it. She photographed the brass medallion on the newel post. Scene 1894. Catherine Whitmore. She interviewed Cordelia about Cornell, about the marriage, about the 35 years of unsigned work, about the settlement, and the motel and the cedar chest, and the letter that had waited 3 decades to be opened. She asked about the lawsuit and the legal strategy, and the counterclaim that David Sullivan had filed 3 weeks ago. And when she was finished, she sat at the kitchen table with Cordelia and said, I'm going to write this for a national magazine. They'll want 9,000 words. I'm going to name Thaddeus. I'm going to name the lawsuit. I'm going to quote the language of the filings. And when I put that language on the page, stripped of the legal confidence it's wrapped in, it's going to read exactly like what it is. A man trying to extract value from a woman's recovered inheritance after spending 35 years extracting value from the woman herself. She looked at Cordelia. Is that all right with you? Cordelia thought about Barrett, about the phone call where he had chosen his father over her. She thought about Vivian reading a script someone had handed her. She thought about Thaddeus standing at the bottom of the porch steps, calculating how much he could take from this place before someone stopped him. Yes, she said. That's all right with me. The article ran on the first Sunday in January. 9,000 words under a headline that Cordelia read standing at the kitchen window with her coffee going cold in her hand. The architect who was erased. How 3 generations of women built buildings and lost their names. It began with Eleanor, the first woman admitted to Penn's architecture program in 1929. The thesis distinction. The 35 years of work attributed to men. The systematic erasure of a career that should have been legendary and instead had been reduced to nothing. It traced Catherine Whitmore Eleanor's grandmother, who had designed and built the Victorian house in 1894. When women were not permitted to be architects, who had carved her initials into the newel post as proof she had been here, and who had been forgotten anyway. It traced Cordelia, the Cornell thesis, the preservation firm she had turned down, the graduate program at Penn she had deferred and never returned to, the 35 years of drafting that had built Ashford Construction's reputation, the settlement, the motel, the cedar chest, the letter, the drive north, and it named Thaddeus. It named the lawsuit. It quoted the exact language of Clifford Drummond's filings, and on the page in plain text, without the procedural complexity to hide behind the filings, read as precisely what they were. A man attempting to extract value from a woman's recovered inheritance, after having spent 35 years extracting value from the woman herself. The article included an interview with David Sullivan about the counterclaim. It detailed the architectural forensics timeline Cordelia had built, the 11,400 hours of unpaid work, the $969,000 in market rate compensation that Thaddeus had never paid. And at the end, it quoted Frank Miller from the hardware store. His entire contribution to the article was one sentence, but Cordelia read it 3 times because she could hear his voice in every word. She paid cash. She asked good questions. She's the best thing that's happened to this town in 40 years. The article went viral by Monday morning. The architectural press picked it up first, then the preservation journals, then the legal blogs. By Wednesday, Dr. Rebecca Foster from Penn's School of Design was on a morning news show talking about Eleanor's erasure and the systematic exclusion of women from architectural history. By Friday, Cordelia had 4,300 unread emails. And on Friday afternoon, David Sullivan called. "Clifford Drummond just filed to dismiss," he said. "All claims, without prejudice, without conditions, without any of the language Thaddeus has been trying to attach to this property for 4 months." There was a pause, and Cordelia could hear something in David's voice she had not heard before. Something that sounded like satisfaction. "He ran," David said. Cordelia stood at the window of the carriage house with the phone in her hand. The light was coming through the wavy glass, the way it did every afternoon diffuse, and even laying its familiar pattern across the chestnut floor. Eleanor's drawings were on the shelves behind her, rolled and tied with brown twine, waiting to be framed and labeled and given back the names that had always belonged to them. She felt something she had not expected to feel. Not triumph, not vindication. Something quieter. The feeling of a structure that has been under lateral stress for a very long time, finally returning to plumb. "Thank you, David," she said. "Miss Ashford," he said. "It was my genuine pleasure." The archive opened on a Saturday in April. The carriage house had been transformed over the winter months. Thomas had installed museum-grade lighting. A carpenter from Scranton had built custom frames for the plans, and they hung now on every wall, protected under conservation glass, each one bearing a small brass plate. E. Whitmore, architect. Bank building reading 1933. E. Whitmore, architect. Schoolhouse, Wilston, 1937. E. Whitmore, architect. Department store, Scranton, 1940. The stamps attributing the work to male supervisors had been digitally removed from the reproductions. The original plans, with their stamps intact, were stored in acid-free folders in a climate-controlled cabinet, preserved as evidence of what had been done and what had been undone. On the wall beside Eleanor's diploma, a second diploma hung in a matching frame. School of Architecture, Cornell University, 1986. Cordelia Caldwell. Honorable mention. Adaptive reuse design. Cordelia had not wanted to hang it. But Dr. Rebecca Foster, who had driven up from Philadelphia for the opening, had insisted. "You found the archive," Dr. Foster had said. "You identified its significance before any institution did. You protected it through a legal challenge that would have ended most projects. You've spent 6 months documenting these plans and preparing them for display. Your name goes on the wall. That's not negotiable." Dr. Foster stood now at the front of the carriage house addressing the 40 people who had gathered for the opening. Colleagues from the Penn Preservation Department, Thomas's network of restoration professionals, Frank and Carol, and a dozen people from Whitmore Falls who had watched Cordelia work through the winter and had decided quietly and without announcement that she was one of them now. Eleanor Whitmore designed over 100 buildings in Pennsylvania between 1929 and 1965, Dr. Foster said. Until 6 months ago, not one of those buildings was attributed to her. Not one preservation survey mentioned her name. She has been absent from every history of American architecture published in the last 60 years. She paused. That ends today. The monograph I've been working on co-authored with Cordelia Ashford will be published this fall. It will document every building Eleanor designed. It will establish her as one of the most significant architects working in Pennsylvania in the mid-20th century. And it will make clear that her erasure was not an accident of history. It was a choice that was made over and over deliberately by people who knew what they were doing. She looked around the room. This archive exists because Cordelia refused to let Eleanor stay erased, and because Thomas Crawford understood what he was looking at and knew it mattered, and because a woman born in 1906 wrote a letter to her niece and said, "When you need this, come and look." There was silence when she finished. Then applause, quiet and sustained, the kind that comes from people who understand they are witnessing something that will outlast them. Cordelia stood by the door and watched and felt the weight of the last 6 months settle into something she could carry without it breaking her. Vivian came with her daughter in late May. Wren was 15, tall and serious, with a focus that reminded Cordelia of herself at that age. She moved through the archive, slowly reading every plate, spending long minutes with the Wilston schoolhouse drawings, which were the most technically accomplished of Eleanor's early work. She carried a sketchbook, the way Cordelia had carried a sketchbook at 15. And from across the room, Cordelia could see that she was copying details from the elevation drawings, not tracing, observing and then rendering from memory, the way you learn something you intend to keep. Vivian stood beside Cordelia for a while, watching her daughter. "She asked me last week if she could apply to Cornell Architecture for early admission," Vivian said. "She's been looking at their portfolio requirements for 6 months. Cordelia said nothing. She watched Wren's pencil move across the page. "Mom," Vivian said quietly, "I want to say something and I'm going to say it badly. So I'm asking you in advance to hear what I mean and not just what I say. All right, I spent a long time not being on your side. Not because I didn't love you, because being on your side cost something, and I wasn't brave enough to pay it. I told myself it was complicated, that it was both of your faults, that there was no right side to be on. And all of that was true in small ways, but it was mostly just easier than being honest. She stopped. I'm sorry. That's what I wanted to say. I'm sorry it took this long. Cordelia watched Wren look up from her sketchbook, study the elevation, look back down, and begin again. You're here now, Cordelia said. Is that enough? It's a start, Vivian said. An honest start. That's more than most things get. Cordelia nodded. She did not push for more, and Vivian, to her credit, did not ask for forgiveness that had not yet been earned. They stood together and watched Wren work, and that was enough for now. On a Sunday afternoon in October, 3 years to the month after Cordelia had first driven up Whitmore Lane and seen the house leaning but not fallen, Wren came out to the porch where Cordelia was sitting with a cup of tea and the light going gold across the yard. Wren had been coming up on weekends since the spring, sometimes with Vivian and sometimes increasingly on her own, on the early Saturday bus from Philadelphia. Cordelia had learned to track the bus schedule without letting Wren know she was tracking it, had learned to have bread and cheese in the kitchen to leave the carriage house unlocked to give the girl space to work, without making her feel watched. Grandma, Wren said, did you know the finial on the turret has the same geometric pattern as the detail on the newel post inside? Cordelia set down her tea and looked at her granddaughter. When did you see that? Last weekend. I measured both of them. Cordelia looked up at the turret. The October light was turning the copper green, and the shadow of the house stretched long across the yard where the leaves had begun to fall. Tell me what else you found, Cordelia said. Wren sat down and opened her sketchbook. For the next hour, as the light changed and the afternoon turned to evening, she walked Cordelia through the measurements and proportional relationships she had been mapping for 6 weeks. She had discovered that the same geometric module ran through the entire house. Catherine's work in 1894, Eleanor's diploma seal from 1929, the restoration details Cordelia had added in 2023. The same underlying grammar expressed in different sentences across 3 generations. It's like a language, Wren said. Like you're all speaking the same language. You just didn't know it until now. Cordelia listened with the full attention of someone who recognizes in the person speaking something she has been waiting a long time to hear. The sound of a mind that understands buildings the way buildings deserve to be understood. Direct, patient, unafraid. Knowledge that does not expire, that only waits to be remembered. You're applying to Cornell, Cordelia said. It was not a question. Yes, Wren said. Early decision. I'm submitting my portfolio in November. Good, Cordelia said. They sat on the porch as the light failed and the first stars came out over the mountains. Somewhere inside, Thomas was washing dishes from the dinner he had cooked for the small group that had gathered to mark the 3rd anniversary of the archive opening. 40 people this time. Colleagues and friends and students from the workshops Cordelia had started teaching at Penn. The house stood sound behind them. The archive held its knowledge in the carriage house, waiting for the next person who would come looking. And 3 generations of women who had built and been erased were no longer erased. Their names were on the walls. Their work was documented, and the knowledge they had carried, the understanding of how buildings speak and what they owe to the people who inhabit them, had passed to a fourth generation who would carry it forward. Cordelia looked at her granddaughter, 15 years old, sitting with a sketchbook in her lap and pencil marks on her fingers, and thought about the letter Eleanor had written 30 years ago. When the time comes that you need it, and only you will know when that is, go and ask. The time had come. The house had been found. The work had been done. And now, finally, the knowledge was passing the way knowledge was supposed to pass, not erased, not forgotten, but given freely to someone who would understand what it meant and what to do with it. "The light's going," Cordelia said. "We should go in." "One more minute," Wren said. She was drawing something, the last sketch of the day, her hand moving quickly across the page. Cordelia waited. And when Wren finally closed the book and stood up, they walked into the house together, leaving the October evening to settle over the yard and the turret and the mountains beyond, where the work of 3 generations stood solid and would stand for as many generations as came after, built to last by people who had known what they were doing and had done it right.